Have you ever been home alone only to get the eerie sensation there was someone else there? Imagine it's late at night and you hear the sound of footsteps, or simply feel another presence in your home with you. Some people might think they're imagining things. Others might jump to the conclusion their home is haunted. But what if neither scenario is correct, and there really is someone living in the house with you? Back in 1922, just outside of Grobern, Bavaria, there once stood a farm located in the woods called Hinterkaifeck, where the family that lived there began to suspect that there might be someone living hidden inside their house. In that particular instance, the family ignored the warning signs and paid the ultimate price for it. All 5 family members, as well as their housekeeper, were later found brutally murdered. Even scarier still, there's evidence the killer kept living inside the house with their dead bodies for days after. Hinterkaifeck was owned by a well-to-do family called the Grubers. The family consisted of the father, 63-year-old Andreas, his 72-year-old wife Cecilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter Victoria, and her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia Jr. and 2-year-old Josef. Andreas used to be a servant for Cecilia and her deceased husband. But after Cecilia's husband died, she married Andreas, and soon after they would go on to have their own daughter, Victoria. Victoria would marry a man named Karl Gabriel, but he was reportedly killed in World War I. Although Victoria would go on to have 2 children, rumors persisted that Karl Gabriel may not have been the father of either one of them. Andreas Gruber was, by most accounts, the most disliked man for miles around. Gruber had a reputation as an unfriendly loner, as well as a wife and child beater. There was also a rumor that his youngest grandchild, Josef, was actually his son, the product of an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria. Although Victoria claimed Josef was actually the product of an affair she'd had with a local man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, although no one in town believed her. Not even Schlittenbauer. For the most part, the Grubers were a pretty reclusive clan. The remote location of their farm helped them keep their distance from the rest of the community. The farm was separated from the nearest town of Kaifeck by the woods all around. The name Hinterkaifeck quite literally translates to behind Kaifeck. The only member of the family anyone from the area knew well, or had anything particularly nice to say about, was Victoria, who sang in the church choir and had a lovely singing voice. Problems arose around the house in October 1921 when the Grubers' live-in maid, Crescens Rieger, abruptly quit her job. She told the family she needed to get as far away from the farm as humanly possible. When asked why, the maid told the family she'd been hearing strange noises at night and other peculiar noises throughout the house, including footsteps that appeared to be coming from inside the attic. "There's something up there," she told them. Rieger was convinced the house was haunted, and she refused to stay 1 second longer. The Grubers thought she was crazy, and they let her go. About 6 months later, in March of 1922, Andreas was surveying his property after a snowstorm when he discovered a set of footprints in the snow that originated in the thick forest nearby and ended right at the tool room attached to the barn. The strange thing was, he couldn't find any footprints that actually led away from the house. They just stopped right there, like the person never left. Andreas became concerned there had been an intruder on his property, but he searched everywhere and found no signs of forced entry. Andreas told his neighbors about the footprints he'd found and asked them if they'd seen any strangers skulking about, but none of them had. Rumors began to spread after that perhaps the maid hadn't been crazy after all, and maybe, just maybe, the Gruber farm really was cursed. That very same night, Andreas was woken from a deep sleep by some strange and unidentifiable noises coming from the attic. Remembering how he'd laughed off the maid as a superstitious fool, he went up there to search, but he found no one hiding there. After that, he returned to bed, but when he awoke the following morning, he was startled to find a strange newspaper on his front porch that no one in his family recognized. Later that month, on March 30th, a set of keys to the house mysteriously disappeared and could not be found. Andreas also discovered a series of scratches on the lock to the tool room as if someone had been trying to pick it. On Friday, May 31st, 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the house, in what has to be one of the worst cases of bad timing in history. You see, Maria's first day on the job would also prove to be her last. It would also be the last day anyone would see any member of the Gruber family alive. At around 3 a.m. on Saturday, April 1st, a farmer noticed 2 figures standing near the property near the edge of the forest. Although when the figures realized they were being watched, they quickly hid their faces and disappeared into the darkness. Later that day, a couple of salesmen visited the property, but they soon left after no one answered their knock on the door. They did later note that the door to the same tool room that Andreas thought somebody had been trying to get into appeared to be slightly ajar. As the week began, Cecilia Jr. failed to show up for school. The following day, the entire family failed to show up for church, which was especially strange for Victoria, who sang in the choir and had never missed practice before. On Tuesday, April 4th, the postman arrived on the Gruber's doorstep and was surprised to see the previous day's mail still sitting there on the porch untouched. He went back to town and alerted some of the townspeople. A search party went to the farm, and at first everything seemed normal, although perhaps a little too quiet. The only sound in the eerie silence was the crunch of their feet in the thin crust of snow covering the frozen ground. The men shouted Andreas Gruber's name, but nobody answered. The searchers went into the barn first, and inside, they discovered a horrific scene. Lying in a pool of blood were the bodies of Andreas, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, and the eldest daughter Cecilia Jr. They were stacked carefully on top of each other and covered in a pile of straw, with a wooden door laying on top of everything else. The horrified searchers went into the house next, dreading the worst. There, they found the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, lying dead in a pool of blood in her own bedroom. They then found the body of 2-year-old Josef in his mother's bedroom, lying in the cot where he normally slept. The townspeople quickly called for help, and within hours the Munich police were on the scene searching for clues. But the evidence they began to piece together only raised more disturbing questions. A preliminary autopsy showed that all the victims had been killed by lethal blows to the head from what appeared to be a pickaxe or a mattock. Although the detectives were unable to find the murder weapon anywhere, whoever had done it appeared to have known what they were doing, because in most of the deaths, the victims' skulls had been crushed with a single blow. Cecilia Sr. and her daughter Victoria both showed signs of strangulation as well, although their causes of death were still reported as a blow to the head. The coroner said that death was immediate for all the victims except for Cecilia, who showed evidence of having survived for several hours before succumbing to her wounds. Investigators noted that she had apparently torn several tufts of her hair from her head before death. Most of the victims were dressed in bedclothes, except for Cecilia and Victoria, which indicated the attacks had likely occurred sometime in the evening around bedtime. Investigators believed the killer had led the victims out to the barn one by one and dispatched them as they entered. They theorized that since Victoria and Cecilia were still dressed in normal clothes, one of them had gone out to the barn first. Then the others began heading out there one by one after to find out what had happened to each of them. After most of the family members were dead, the killer then went to the farmhouse to murder the maid and the little boy. Now, all this would be disturbing enough on its own, but once the coroner determined the date of death had been Friday, March 31st, investigators quickly realized whoever killed the family had continued living there inside the house for several days after. Detectives questioned the neighbors and discovered several witnesses who claimed to have seen smoke rising from the chimney over the next couple days. Inside the house were signs that someone had been eating meals there after the family were already dead. One of the beds showed evidence that someone had been recently sleeping in it. Also, all the livestock on the farm had been fed and cared for. Whoever had done it clearly knew their way around a farm. The family dog, although barking and visibly shaken, had also been carefully tied up and cared for in the barn as well. One major stumbling block for investigators was how poorly maintained the crime scene had been. A number of people had been tromping all over the scene all day, even before the police got there. The bodies had been moved before the police arrived. Some people even cooked meals in the kitchen. For investigators, it was difficult enough to fathom what could drive a person to not only perform such a vicious and cold-blooded series of murders, but for the person to actually continue living inside the house with the bodies as if everything was normal. At first, police thought that robbery might be a potential motive, but inside the house they found a large amount of cash and valuable jewelry that remained untouched. One curious detail they did learn, though, was that Victoria cleaned out her bank account a few weeks earlier and left a $700 gold mark donation to her church, but the rest of her money remained unaccounted for. Ruling out robbery as a motive, police then considered that it may have been a crime of passion. Suspicion soon fell upon a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the very same man Victoria claimed to be Josef's father. Police theorized that Schlittenbauer may have lashed out in a jealous rage over Victoria's incestuous relationship with her father. There was even a financial component to this theory, since apparently Victoria had been considering suing Schlittenbauer for child support for young Josef. Schlittenbauer was already remarried at that point, and he'd had another son who died at an early age. It probably would have been infuriating for him to have to pay alimony for a son he wasn't even convinced was his. Schlittenbauer lived only 350 meters away from the Gruber farm. On the day the bodies were discovered, he raised suspicions right away. He had actually been part of the initial search party. Some of the other members of the search party noticed that the dog, which was tied up in the barn, took an immediate dislike to the man as soon as he went inside. Not only that, but Schlittenbauer seemed oddly calm as he lifted the wooden door, then moved each of the bodies aside. When asked what he was doing, he told the others he was looking for his boy Josef. At the same time, there was reportedly very little emotion in his voice as he said this. Then, after Schlittenbauer was unable to find Josef in the pile, he did something else very curious. He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door to the kitchen. If you recall, Andreas Gruber told people he had lost a set of keys several days earlier. All this was enough to put Lorenz Schlittenbauer at the top of the list of suspects. But although the man's actions were suspicious, police had no physical evidence to arrest him either. One other theory some people came up with was that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, killed them all. Although it was widely believed the man had died in World War I, his body was never recovered. Some people theorize that Gabriel may have faked his own death, only to change his mind at some point and return to find that Victoria had a son with another man, causing him to snap and kill them all in a jealous rage. But this story remains just pure speculation. There's simply no evidence to show that Gabriel didn't die in the war, as was commonly believed. In 1951, a full 3 decades after the murders, a woman named Crescentia Mayer made a shocking deathbed confession. She told a pair of priests that her brothers Adolf and Anton Gump had committed the murders. A prosecutor named Andreas Popp took this confession seriously enough to reopen the case. Adolf Gump had a violent reputation. There were also rumors that Adolf once had a romantic relationship with Victoria. Popp theorized that perhaps the man snapped and murdered the family after hearing about the incest rumors between Victoria and Andreas. But by that point in time, Adolf Gump had already died in World War II, although Anton was still alive. Police questioned him, but he denied the accusations against him and his brother. Although according to one unverified account, while Anton was in jail, he confided to a cellmate that his brother Adolf had murdered the family. Some of Crescentia Mayer's family members would later claim the old woman was both spiteful and delusional, and that there was no truth to her deathbed confession. In 1971, a woman only identified as Therese T. wrote a letter to police describing memories she'd had of her mother speaking to another older woman, the mother of Andreas and Karl Schreier. The elderly woman confessed to Therese's mother that her sons had murdered the Grubers and that one of them was worried that someone would find a pocket knife he'd lost. A knife that could tie him to the killings. At the time of the murders, the Schreier brothers were working in the area, and they often walked right past the Gruber farm. They also had a reputation for violence. There was even a 1922 newspaper article about the case that mentioned 2 unnamed brothers were looked at as suspects, although no charges were ever officially brought against them. Since most of this story is based on hearsay, though, it's impossible to say how much of it we should believe. Another group of suspects were 3 men, Anton and Karl Bickler, and Georg Siegel. After the bodies were discovered, police questioned everyone connected to the family, including their first maid, Crescenz Rieger. She told police she suspected 3 men, including Anton Bickler, who once worked for the Grubers. Anton was among the many locals who had a grudge against Andreas Gruber, remarking once how the man ought to be dead. According to Rieger, the man's brother Karl once showed up outside her bedroom window and made a pointed reference to Victoria sleeping in Andreas's bed. Rieger found the entire encounter disturbing. The third man she implicated was Georg Siegel, another former employee of the Grubers. In fact, he was the man who carved the wooden handle of the mattock believed to be the murder weapon. Although Siegel strongly denied having anything to do with the murders, Crescenz Rieger told police the man actually once broke into the house on a previous occasion a couple of years earlier. All 3 men were interrogated but never formally charged due to lack of evidence. Apparently, Crescenz Rieger had a lot of potential suspects in mind. She also implicated 2 brothers, Andreas and Josef Thaler, a couple of petty criminals known to work the area. According to Rieger, one of the brothers also showed up outside her window one day and asked where Victoria slept. But this story sounds a lot like the one she previously told about the Bickler brothers, though, so it's difficult to say how much of it we should believe. Once again, there was no physical evidence tying the Thalers to the murders, so they were never arrested. More recently, author Bill James in his book The Man from the Train alleged that a German migrant named Paul Mueller may have been responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders. Mueller was the only suspect in the 1897 murder of a Massachusetts family. Bill James believes that Mueller may have been a prolific serial killer responsible for dozens of axe murders across the United States. He also suggests in his book that Mueller may have returned to his homeland in 1912 and kept on killing from there. There's very little evidence to support this theory, though. In the end, all we are left with are a lot of unanswered questions. Why had the killer remained in the house for nearly a week after the murders? Why were the animals so well taken care of? If the original maid had been correct in hearing signs of occupation months before, does that mean the killer had been living undetected inside the home for as much as 6 months? And if that's even remotely possible, why? And why wait until that day in particular to murder them all? Could the new maid have discovered the hidden intruder so he was forced to act before she revealed him to the family? The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders went on for years. Police looked at more than 100 suspects but never made any arrests. The bodies were buried in a graveyard in Weidhofen, although one curious detail is that they were buried without their heads, which were sent to a lab in Munich for further analysis. There are even some stories claiming that police called in a psychic to try to take clairvoyant readings from the skulls, but nothing ever came of the lab's tests, and the skulls were never returned. Sometime during World War II, the skulls were lost in the chaos. About a year after the murders, the farm was demolished. As the months wore on, many rumors persisted that the place was haunted. So the townspeople ultimately decided the best course of action was to wipe the place off the map. But as workmen demolished the barn, they did find something the police had never been able to recover: the murder weapon. Inside a secret compartment in the barn's hayloft, they found the mattock that had killed them all. It was hidden away in such a location that almost certainly only someone with personal knowledge of the farm would have known to hide it there. In addition, something else of note that they found near the mattock was a pocket knife. While far from definitive, if you recall the story about the Schreier brothers, one of them allegedly claimed to have lost just such a knife while committing the murders. To my mind, though, the most likely suspect remains Lorenz Schlittenbauer. The man lived right next door to the Gruber farm. He also had a serious financial motive to commit the murders, since Victoria was planning on suing him for financial support of young Joseph, a boy that, rumor had it, may not have even been his son, and was the product of incest with Andreas. The entire situation would have not only ruined Schlittenbauer financially, but it probably would have destroyed his new family and his public reputation as well. So, Schlittenbauer had plenty of motivation to get rid of Victoria and her family. Since there were no signs of forced entry, it seems likely whoever committed the murders would have gained entry some other way. As Schlittenbauer demonstrated during the search for the family, he had a key to get into the home. Since he was a farmer himself, he almost certainly would have known his way around the handling the farm implements and where they would be stored. In addition, whoever committed these murders didn't appear to be some crazed killer. These murders were methodical, and whoever committed them did so without it leaving a huge blood trail behind. Since there were so many signs that whoever did it had been on the farm for weeks prior watching the family, someone who lived nearby would be the most obvious suspect. Someone who was not only familiar with the area, but with the Gruber farm itself. Perhaps the arrival of the new maid accelerated whatever plans Schlittenbauer had been making to murder everyone. There is even a certain logic in the killer continuing to live on the farm, feed the animals, and keep the fire going in the chimney. By doing so, the killer would have been able to maintain the illusion that the Grubers was still alive for several days. This would have given the killer time to clean up any evidence, and if the killer was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, it also would have given him time to return to his own home nearby at his leisure, and make everything appear as if it were normal. On the day the bodies were found, Schlittenbauer did do a number of suspicious things. He disturbed the crime scene after he entered the barn, moving around both the wooden door and the bodies. He later claimed he was looking for his son Joseph, which is odd all on its own because the man had previously disowned that child. This is clearly the theory that makes the most sense. Lorenz Schlittenbauer had the motive, means, and opportunity to have committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. But at the same time, no conclusive evidence against the man was ever produced. Accusations would continue to follow Schlittenbauer for the remainder of his life, something that he always vehemently denied. He even filed several defamation lawsuits in order to defend his reputation. The Gruber farm is long gone, but currently there's a small shrine nearby marking the events that happened there. In 2007, a group of students at the Munich Police Academy were given the Hinterkaifeck murders as a test case for them to solve using modern technology and detection methods. They announced that they had identified a likely suspect, although they refused to name that person publicly. Although it seems pretty likely it had to be Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Ultimately, though, the forensic class concluded that the Hinterkaifeck murders would remain forever unsolved for lack of evidence. So who do you think killed the family at Hinterkaifeck? Leave me a comment below and let me know your theories. Thanks for checking out this video. If you liked it and want to see more like it, leave me a comment below.